And I have to be nice because she speaks after me, so I guess I'll just keep it really simple. Minister Wilson-Raybould is a member of the Wee-Wai-Kai Nation on Vancouver Island. She's a lawyer, advocate, and a leader among BC First Nations as a former regional chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations. And so she brings extensive experience in law, public service, and First Nations governance to Cabinet. After being called to the bar in 2000, Minister Wilson-Raybould began her legal career working as a provincial Crown prosecutor in Vancouver. She later served as an advisor at the BC Treaty Commission, and the poor woman had to witness some of the treaty negotiations at the Tsawwassen table in that capacity, most of them. In 2004, she was elected as commissioner by the chiefs of the First Nations Summit, and after she was elected regional chief of the BCAFN in 2009, she devoted herself to the advancement of First Nations governance, fair access to land and resources, as well as improved education and healthcare services. She was re-elected as regional chief in 2012 and held responsibilities for governance and nation building on the AFN executive. In 2015, she was appointed as Minister of Justice and Attorney General, and she's here to talk about reconciliation, a topic I know she cares a great deal about and have seen her work her whole career in trying to advance this discussion. So please join me in welcoming the Honourable Jody Wilson-Raybould.
Well, Galakasla, thank you for that kind introduction, Quantiltanot. Kim and I have been friends for many years. First of all, Galakasla, bonjour tout le monde. It's my incredible honor to be here to speak to this policy forum. And there she is. I just wanted to acknowledge Elder Commanda and everyone that's here, chiefs, leaders, matriarchs, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the invitation. And I want to acknowledge my new parliamentary secretary, Marco Mendicino, who is going to be working with me very closely when it comes to Indigenous issues. But I, again, like to thank the Public Policy Forum for inviting me to speak here. And I would also like to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Algonquin people whose ancestral lands we are gathered on. I'm pleased to be here this afternoon, and certainly it is a testament, given the numbers, to the increasing recognition of the role that Indigenous peoples in Canada are playing and will play, that so many of our country's leading thinkers on issues of public administration and governance are eager to come and discuss what reconciliation and inclusive growth can mean for First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples and all Canadians. I also wanted to thank the National Aboriginal Economic Development Board and the National Aboriginal Capital Corporation for partnering with our government on this important event. It is really good to see a lot of familiar faces here, many from the west coast of British Columbia, old friends and colleagues. So many of you who have heard me speak before have heard me discuss the issues that I'm going to touch on today in other venues, and in particular when I was the regional chief of the BC Assembly of First Nations and while on council in my home community of Wei-Wai-Kai. While I may be in a different role, my perspective on Indigenous nations and rebuilding has not changed. As a country, we know we have much work ahead of us in moving forward to ensure that Indigenous peoples can take their rightful place within Confederation. And there is no question that Indigenous peoples are in a tremendous period of transformation, of transition, rebuilding their nations. Today's theme session, Expanding the Circle, is particularly meaningful. Our circle has been incomplete because it speaks to how Indigenous peoples have not been included at the same time negatively impacted in much of the evolution of Canada. Expanding the circle embodies the need for Canada's society and economy to expand to provide opportunities for more Indigenous communities to become prosperous, healthy, and culturally thriving. For far too long in Canada, colonial legislation, policies, and attitudes have worked to hinder the economic potential of Indigenous nations. For far too long, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples have been excluded from the opportunities that most Canadians take for granted. To me, today is an opportunity to talk about how our government's commitment to a true nation-to-nation relationship with Indigenous peoples will enable that expansion. At the same time, through the work that we are doing, work that is imperative to the future economy and society of Canada as a whole, we acknowledge the economic dimensions of Aboriginal title and rights and recognize the need to build a collaborative climate of predictability and clarity. It is an opportunity for me to share with you some of the my thoughts on our collective journey, and in particular, as we reflect on Canada 150. While I recognize that many Indigenous peoples feel that there is little to celebrate with regard to the past 150 years of our country's history, I truly believe that there is optimism and hope for the next 150 years. Also, let us not forget that this year also marks the 35th anniversary of the adoption of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms and Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982, both incredibly important in charting the path for the next 150 years. As a government, we recognize that the fundamental purpose of Section 35 is reconciliation of the prior occupation of Indigenous peoples with Crown sovereignty. And we are fully committed to fulfilling the constitutional promise made to Indigenous peoples in 1982. And personally, I would add, my cultural teachings and my previous work has always spoken about being optimistic. And this optimism is not just tied to my current role and the constitutional provisions just cited, but it is an optimism rooted in the resilience and work of Indigenous peoples who have sought justice through reconciliation for generations. Accordingly, as we look back, but more importantly, look forward, this year marks an especially fitting occasion to envision the role that Indigenous nations will have and indeed must have in Canada, where the outcome of true reconciliation must be to ensure that Indigenous peoples are finally accorded the opportunity to fully participate in the economic and social fabric of our country. So in keeping with the conference theme and focus, I will speak to how, in my view, reconciliation will support economic growth for First Nations peoples. But before I do, I need to say something about the commitments our government has made and the pace of change. Rightfully so, a lot has been made of the commitments we have made to Indigenous peoples and to resetting the relationship with Indigenous peoples in this country. A principled relationship based on the recognition of rights, respect, cooperation, and partnership. So our government is now some 15 months into our mandate, and there are those who have questioned the strength of our commitment to Indigenous issues. Let me say this. Our commitment is as strong as ever. Our Prime Minister has made it very clear that we need an all-of-government approach based on recognition of Indigenous peoples and their rights to address the colonial legacy in a substantive and meaningful way that will be transformative. We have been laying the internal groundwork to advance this shift, and we will be taking more publicly visible and bold action. In December, the Prime Minister Trudeau, announced that he will be establishing a new and important working group of ministers who will be tasked with reviewing federal laws, policies, and operational practices related to Indigenous peoples and their rights. It is anticipated that this working group will work with a broad range of partners and experts, and of course work with Indigenous peoples and communities to assess and recommend what statutory changes and new policies are needed to best meet our constitutional obligations and international commitments to Indigenous peoples. As some of you have heard me say before when speaking about reconciliation, we should remember the words of the late Nelson Mandela, who, reflecting on his own country, stated that, and I paraphrase, beyond the necessary healing and truth-telling, reconciliation actually requires laws to change and policies to be rewritten. By making these systemic shifts, we will be setting ourselves on a new path and course which breaks from past patterns and secures a new future for Indigenous peoples and all Canadians. As a starting point, there is a need to take a principled approach to the review of laws and policies based on the recognition of Indigenous peoples and their rights. To this end, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples provides a framework for our reconciliation efforts, and by implementing it, we can create the space for real and practical shifts in the economic, social, and human well-being of Indigenous peoples across Canada. The Declaration has been and will continue to be instrumental in informing our work as we develop a Canadian framework for reconciliation rooted in our unique constitutional and legal structures, which I view as the strongest way to ensure the dignity of Indigenous peoples and thriving communities. As I've said before, and as anticipated by Article 38 of the United Nations Declaration, implementing the United Nations Declaration will require a set of new laws, policies, institutions, structures, and patterns of relationships that fit together and acknowledge and integrate Indigenous knowledge, perspectives, and legal traditions. Our government is committed to undertaking this important work here in Canada to ensure the necessary mechanisms are put in place to actually do it. It will not be easy, and at times it will be contentious. This is because deconstructing Canada's colonial past, the last 150 years, requires both the federal government and our provincial partners, where appropriate, and Indigenous peoples and their governments to be self-reflective, ask some incredibly difficult questions, and more importantly, come up with solutions to the challenges that in the past have been seen to be too insurmountable to overcome. For example, and given that this forum is speaking specifically to First Nations, let us consider for a moment the interplay between the United Nations Declaration and the Indian Act. The UN Declaration points us to how fundamental the work of nation rebuilding with Indigenous peoples is as a critical part of recognition and reconciliation. Accordingly, this must be a central part of our work. Two of the most important articles, in my view, of the Declaration are Articles 3 and 4. Article 3 states, quote, Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status and freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. Article 4 states Indigenous peoples, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal or local affairs, as well as the ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. In stark contrast to the Declaration, the Indian Act imposes a system of band council government. Obviously, on the face of it, a federal statute such as the Indian Act determining the political status of a group of Indigenous peoples is contrary to Articles 3 and 4 of the Declaration. Another example of how the Indian Act is at odds with the Declaration would be Article 33, which speaks to Indigenous peoples determining for themselves the membership of their nations. Yet, in Canada, only those Indigenous nations which are recognized as self-governing truly determine their citizenship. For persons that are constitutionally recognized as Indians, this represents still only about or approximately 40 former INAC bands, including Tawasin, which my good friend is a member of, Kim Baird. So for all other First Nations, everyone else who is not self-governing, the INAC continues to impose a system of government and rules. The challenge is for each of the nations to truly self-determine how they are going to govern themselves, how they are going to organize, and who they are. Fundamental problems of the INAC system, from a recognition of rights perspective aside, and speaking from a pragmatic one of supporting economic development and growing Indigenous economies, it is very clear that governing Indians and lands reserved for the Indians under Section 9124 of the Constitution, separate and apart from other Canadians under the paternalistic Indian Act, has contributed to the lack of economic activity on reserves. Indeed, the very limitations of Indian Act reserve-based government that hindered the ability of First Nations to develop economies on reserve lands are now the same impediments to engaging with industry and businesses off reserve within the broader traditional territories and therefore impacting the broader economy. The Indian Act is neither an appropriate framework for governance for First Nations people nor any people for that matter. With respect to on-reserve management and administration, as part of the transition to self-government, thankfully this is changing, but too slow and perhaps not evenly. Over the past 30 years, again, as I know many of you in this room know who were involved in many of the First Nations-led governance initiatives are fully aware, there have been a number of attempts to at least improve some aspects of governance on reserve. And here I'm not just thinking about the more high-profile modern treaties or self-government arrangements, but also sectoral governance initiatives such as the First Nations Land Management Act or the First Nations Fiscal Management Act. With respect to the FNLMA, in my previous life, I had the honor to be elected to the Lands Board, given that my home community has a land code. I am also very well aware of the Fiscal Management Act and the importance of the initiatives to strengthen the ability of First Nations to raise revenues, as well as to borrow monies on the bond market and generally establish sound financial administrative systems. The role of the First Nations Finance Authority, the Financial Management Board, and the First Nations Tax Commission are very critical. And in my opinion, there is a need to consider how we can support additional Indigenous institutions that support nation rebuilding. But here's the challenge as I see it. While there are a number of very important First Nations-led governance initiatives, their foundation in terms of core governance is still the Indian Act. They are all initiatives that have the Indian Act band as established under the Indian Act as an imposed system of government at their core. Further, they really only address a small amount of reserve lands that were historically set aside for Indians and do not deal with shared, collaborative, or consensus-based decision-making, or multi-level governance beyond the reserve boundaries. So to be clear, what I'm saying is not to in any way diminish the importance of these initiatives or the advancements that have been made to developing strong and appropriate governance for the communities that have set them up. On the contrary, what I am saying is that if we are to get rid of the Indian Act, we need to determine how First Nations transition away from band government to something which is reflective of the proper title and rights holder, Indigenous modes of governance, and legal traditions, which is truly an expression of self-determination, whether those communities are part of an historic treaty or whether they have not entered into a treaty. And to this end, again, to be clear, the Government of Canada cannot do this. It is not appropriate, nor is it the role of the Government of Canada to determine, impose, or direct these Indigenous modes and systems, what these Indigenous modes and systems of government should be. Only Indigenous peoples can determine their institutions and shape their future. What I can say, however, is that the government can no longer be an obstacle to nation rebuilding by imposing a system of government through instruments such as the Indian Act. So if we are to reset the relationship based on recognition, this is one of the fundamental institutional challenges we face and need to address in determining a path forward. While we may now agree that we need to move away from the Indian Act towards self-government, and I do not need to tell anyone in this room what a challenge that has become, especially given that for some the Indian Act has become entrenched as a part of life. In finding the path to self-determination that includes moving away from the Indian Act, the reality of our post-colonial transition to date has been that, short of a court saying Indigenous peoples have the right over land or the right to govern themselves, Indigenous peoples had to negotiate self-government with the Crown and then, community by community, vote to remove the government's paternalistic role in their lives. This approach has been slow, marked with adversarialism that often runs contrary to reconciliation and is not nearly as effective, principled, or as collaborative as it should and could be. No other segment of Canadian society has had to decolonize and then go through this process to establish basic structures of governance to create tools for economic and social development. So in terms of the review of laws and policies, it is my expectation that we will start with those policies that speak to the fundamental principle of recognition and that reflect our unique legal situation in Canada, Section 35. Through recognition, we will create an environment where the real work of nation building and rebuilding and reconciliation can advance in significant and innovative ways. For example, this means looking at the Comprehensive Claims Policy, a series of policies and mandates dealing with land matters, as well as the Inherent Right of Self-Government Policy that deals with governance matters. We will also be looking at existing legislation that applies to Indigenous peoples with an expectation that there will be significant changes to some of that legislation. Taking into consideration, of course, the need to continue to support federal legislation that was jointly developed with Indigenous peoples. Clearly, as we move forward, we should build on our success, on your success, and what we have learned both in terms of governance and establishing effective mechanisms to support economic development on reserve. We need to make more opportunities available to communities that are ready, willing, and able to move forward. For there to be reconciliation and for the transition to be transformational and enduring, communities, both individually and collectively as peoples, need to self-determine their governing structures and institutions and completely embrace Articles 3 and 4 of the Declaration and what is meant by the inherent right of self-government as protected under Section 35. As we move forward, in my opinion, we also need to give more consideration to how we support Indigenous-controlled institutions that advance nation rebuilding, so that it is Indigenous peoples that govern these institutions with a vested interest in the outcome of the work they do and the decisions they make. Nation rebuilding is the real work ahead of us, ahead of all of you. The foundational work based on recognition where Indigenous nations are providing their own proposals or solutions for how they seek to organize and be recognized, and where the role of the federal government is to support that work and move away from its current role of administering Indian reserves for First Nations. As we implement the declaration, we need to look to the lands and resources that Indigenous peoples have rights to and that can further support their economies and the ability to raise money to provide programs and services to meet the needs of their citizens. We need to consider what the courts have referred to as the inescapable economic component of Aboriginal title in Delgamuukw, and how we can broaden the applicability of that concept to the ancestral lands of our nations. Meanwhile, as we look to develop new tools and mechanisms with respect to the relationship, governance, access to lands and resources, and the new fiscal relationship, we also have to ensure that the pressing and, of course, immediate health, social, and education needs are also being addressed. It's somewhat of a catch-22. As the relationship around governance, land, and fiscal matters between the Crown and Indigenous peoples are dealt with, more opportunities will be created. But without healthy or educated citizens in Indigenous communities, the ability to act on those opportunities can and may be hindered. There are basic needs that must be met now: clean water, safe housing. There are issues of suicide, children and families that must be addressed. We do have parallel work to do. But moving forward, we need leadership, vision, and goodwill. And of course, we need trust, which is perhaps the hardest to come by given the colonial legacy. But because I know that there have been successes, and I know that there are good people, like my colleague and friend, the Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs, Carolyn Bennett, that are truly committed to reconciliation, I have the confidence that we can finally meet the great challenge of our generation that has for so long remained quite elusive for so many. Change is truly occurring, but of course, we are not going to solve all of the challenges facing Indigenous communities overnight. For some nations, the transition will happen relatively quickly if the mechanisms for the transition are put in place, as we have seen in communities that have already begun to rebuild their governing institutions, and in some cases where a new generation of First Nations people have never known a life under the Indian Act. For some communities, however, it will take a little more time than others to rebuild and before there is comparability in social indicators and outcomes. In some cases, there are challenges of remoteness and geography. In others, there is the question of size and the need for aggregation and cooperation, where there is a need to look beyond the nation and for nations to work together. What we can do as a government, based on an approach founded on recognition and regardless of the nation's current situation, is to set our country on a path that cannot be reversed, and where the systemic limitations to change that is reflected in laws and policies are removed. This is a new vision for our country, and while we may not have all of the answers as to what an approach based on recognition will mean in all cases, nor is it likely that every step we take in this transformational time will be perfect, what is certain is that the vision of reconciliation based on recognition will change our country, and for the better. It will create the space where colonialism and paternalism give way to recognition, responsibility, and opportunity, and where working together we can develop solutions and build a future jointly. So to conclude, Canada's economy and First Nations and our collective future are intertwined. It is essential we undertake this work of reconciliation that will enable us to build a future together. In expanding the circle, clearly, if we want to unlock our collective social, cultural, and economic potential, it is needed. Personally, as a proud Kwakwaka'wakw woman and an incredibly proud Canadian, I am optimistic, but at the same time, I know the challenge that is ahead of us. I firmly believe that the recognition of Indigenous rights and economic growth are not mutually exclusive. To the contrary, I believe that reconciliation founded on recognition is the sure path to economic growth, not just for First Nations, but for all Canadians. Evidence clearly shows that where governance reform has been successful, economic opportunity has followed. And as I have stated before, unlocking the economic potential and business success of First Nations is not the end itself, but rather the means to an end. The end being healthier and more prosperous First Nations communities, with our peoples enjoying a better quality of life with practicing and thriving cultures. And as we reflect on 150 years of Confederation, and as we look forward to the next 150 years, we must never lose sight of this objective, and I incredibly look forward to doing this work together. Gala Kasla, thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Minister. I know the Minister has other pressing obligations, so she'll be leaving us right away. But I do want to reflect on your very candid comments about the need to have difficult discussions about this topic in undoing 150 years of colonization. It's indeed a very difficult task we all have ahead of us, and I think we need to really be prepared to show resolve, to be determined, to all do our part in overcoming these really, really entrenched issues. So thanks again, Minister, and I am always honored to hear you speak. And yeah, thank you. Our next panel is going to be led by Dr. Marie Delorme. So I'll invite her to introduce the panelists, and as she's coming up, I'll introduce her. Dr. Delorme is the CEO of the Imagination Group of companies specializing in guiding organizations to operate more efficiently and profitably by focusing on the spectrum of challenges that business leaders and governments face, from long-range planning to critical day-to-day business issues. She also owns Nation Imagination, the Aboriginal gifting company, with a signature line of products featuring the works of Aboriginal artists. And thank you. How are you?
Well, thank you. I was so inspired listening to Minister Wilson-Raybould. I was particularly taken by her comment that reconciliation was a path to economic growth. And I think that's a very nice lead-in to the very esteemed panel that we have assembled here. I'm very pleased to be monitoring this panel. The focus of this is community economic growth. So we are going to hear stories and perspectives and words of wisdom from three individuals who are leaders in our First Nations communities. So joining me today is Chief Lynn Akus, Chief Reginald Bellerose, and Andrew Leach. And I shall provide you with brief introductions. I have a feeling that many of you know these individuals. Chief Lynn Akus is from the Sagamay First Nation, which is in Treaty 4 territory. That's about an hour and 45 minutes east of Regina. She has been heavily involved in the arts and she has served as director of the Sagawawak Artists Collective. She was the artistic director of the Sagawawak Storytellers Festival from 2002 to 2004, and general manager of the Commonweal Community Arts in Regina. In 2007, Chief Ekus was elected to the Sagamay First Nation Council, and she is now in her 4th term as chief. Chief Reginald Bellerose is the chief of the Muscowegan First Nation, and he has been serving in that capacity since 2005. Muscowegan is also in Treaty 4 territory, and it's about an hour and 40 minutes northeast of Regina. Previously, Chief Bellerose held positions at the Royal Bank, the University of Alberta in Edmonton, and Junior Achievement Canada. Andrew Leach is a proud member of the Statliam Nation in the interior of British Columbia. He is serving as the Chief Administrator Officer of Tsleil-Waututh Nation, which is near Vancouver. He also operates a management consulting business, which has provided leadership to over 150 First Nations over the past 20 years. Andrew Leach is chair of the National Aboriginal Capital Corporation, who is our partner in this session today. So I think it would be very appropriate from a community economic development perspective to start perhaps with giving us a little bit of a background. And Chief Ekus, I'd like to start with you. Can you briefly tell us about the journey of your First Nations? What is the current state? What have you experienced? And what do you see in the future when you look at community economic growth?
Thanks, Dr. DeLorme. I first of all want to acknowledge the prayers that were rendered on our behalf this morning, and I want to acknowledge the territory of the Shinabeg that we're meeting at today. I always like to express where our community at is in terms of the context of treaty, and I always try to explain the basis of our economic direction in terms of where we've been historically, and as our foundation for moving forward. We're a Soto community. We were called Soto by the French because we came from Sault Ste. Marie. We're Anishinaabe plain. So Jebwaya is another word that's used to describe us. So we followed the fur trade out west. We were partners in creating an economic base for Canada by way of our participation in the fur trade. So we're always acutely aware that we were part of a partnership in creating an economic base in Canada. We, of course, when the fur trade collapsed, our livelihood, the buffalo, the very large herds of buffalo that we relied on when we moved out to the Western Plains, was the buffalo were exterminated, and so our way of life and our livelihood, our way of feeding ourselves, and our way of living on the land, like following the buffalo herds in the summer. In the wintertime, we'd winter in the valley or where we could access lakes so that we could feed ourselves. We could eat fish and small game in the winter. So that was our way of feeding ourselves, but we also had internal and external trade and economy as Anishinaabe people. Chief Bellerose and I are both from Treaty 4, which is the modern day version of the Iron Nations Alliance. We are an alliance of Cree, Soto, and Nakota people. We were called the Iron Nations Alliance because we had allied ourselves in that territory, and we were very successful in acquiring iron goods, which made us economically a powerhouse in the Western Plains. So then the colonial government decided that they were going to sign treaty with the Iron Nations Alliance, or enter into treaty with the Iron Nations Alliance. So it was a natural fit, right, that the Iron Nations Alliance would collectively enter into treaty with the Crown. So within treaty, I'll try to keep this short. It's a long explanation, but within treaty there are economic provisions within treaty. There is a guarantee of hunting, fishing, and trapping. So back then, hunting, fishing, trapping meant that we were self-determining. We could feed ourselves from the land. We could look after our families, and we could work together collectively to ensure that we had sustenance or a livelihood. So that's our self-determined economic guarantee under treaty. That's our inherent right under treaty, being recognized under treaty. On the other hand, there's also the annuities provision. They say the cows and plows provision in treaty, which said that we would be provided tools and seed, agricultural tools, seed, carpenter's tools, and also the schoolhouse, right, was a guarantee under treaty. So when you put it in the context of spirit and intent of treaty, it doesn't mean we're still allowed to hunt, fish, and trap, and Canada will give us seed every year. It means that in today's context, in the spirit and intent of treaty, we were guaranteed that we would continue to pursue our self-determined, our own self-determined forms of economic development, trade, having free, prior, and informed consent on the things that occurred on our lands. That is self-determining. And we were also under the agricultural provisions. We were also guaranteed that we would be assisted in entering into mainstream economic pursuits. So those are the two aspects of economic development in treaty. So Sagamay First Nation, we know very acutely how difficult that is to carry out the promise of treaty in terms of economic development. We're at a lake. We're at the lake shore because we settled near the lake so that we could feed ourselves in the winter. In the 50s, our people decided we were going to lease cottage lots. So we have 300 lakefront, well, most of them are lakefront, but we have 300 cottage lots that we lease to people who own cabins on our land. So because we determined that we were going to pursue some mainstream economics, we've foregone our livelihood that we derive from the lake, right? It was a compromise. That was a compromise, and because we had to do this under the Indian Act, we found that it was difficult to maintain our relationship with our lake and maintain the relationship with the land and the animals from our valley. We had to do it under the Indian Act. We had to lease our lands under the Indian Act, under 5360 of the Indian Act. So we have a lands department that manages over 300 leases who are not trained in business. They're not trained in land development. When we developed our lake shore, the properties there, when we surveyed everything out, we didn't even put in an area properly survey an easement so that we could run servicing along a roadway, right? Just rudimentary things that you need to know when developing land. So that's been a challenge, right? That's just a concrete example of how the Indian Act really interferes with economic development. So briefly, in summary, I'll say we've bought land under our specific claims, and that land is city of Yorkton, and also on the outskirts of Regina. We've also bought agricultural land under specific claims, but our lands in the outskirts of Regina, we've been negotiating many years for extra municipal services from the city of Regina. We've been negotiating with Canada to enter into a brand new head lease. We've been negotiating to develop our land on the outskirts of Regina for the last 5 years. If a business person had to take 5 years to develop their property, they'd go bankrupt. So I'll leave it at that. I thank you for your patience. Sorry, I'm taking so long.
Thank you, Chief Akers. Chief Belrose, can you provide us a brief perspective on your community in the context of community economic development? Tell us a little bit about your journey.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Good afternoon. Greet everybody. Acknowledge the protocol, the elder, the prayer, the territory we're on. And I guess a lot of successful, accomplished people in the room. And I don't know how I get to sit here, but I'll share a little bit about our story, our journey. Really, it's about attracting investment on reserve. And, there's so many opportunities to do with traditional lands, traditional territory. And really what I wanted to do was, alleviate poverty. And those that are elected in this room, especially First Nation leaders, you'll understand the challenges of poverty. And really, that was a key driver for me, is to say, I believe that Treaty 4 was signed. I don't believe we're supposed to be the poorest people in this country. I don't believe we were supposed to be the unhealthiest people. I don't believe we were supposed to be deprived. I have so much confidence in our chiefs who were there that wasn't their intention. But ultimately, 2017, that's where we're at. So by trying to attract investment on reserve, I put together a strategy of implementing treaty. That sounds so easy, but welfare, Indian Act, residential school, all of those things done their job right to a T. So now when you talk implementing treaty, implementing inherent rights, that's to a colonized people who say, I don't want to give up welfare. I want to hold on to welfare because I get my power paid. I get my energy paid. I got food in the fridge. Why would I want to go have a job? So those are really, really tough issues to deal with. And with us, we're in the potash belt, and we had started to look at resource development, and people laughed in my face and said, this will never happen. So part of what we tried to do is to, how do we go about taking the steps we need to? So one of them was security. How do you issue security under the Indian Act? Well, you can't do that at a band council resolution because no one will write checks on that. So we met with the department, and you got to go through all these votes, and you got to spend years and years explaining to the people. So we went through that process. You're selling the land. You're selling us out. Why would I vote? And so those are some of the things we did. And then once we figured out we have a world-class resource that we're on, what can we do with it? So then you try to find partners. I've been on Bay Street. They kicked me around on Bay Street. You Indians are like third world countries. You have no political stability. You have no rules, no rule book that says here's how capital comes on reserve. Here's how it's managed. Here's how it grows. You have none of that. You guys are in a 2-year elected system. No one's going to write checks for you. Big checks. Because we're talking billions of dollars, right? So people looked and said, why would you talk billions? I only deal with $255 a month. So it's like, you try to explain, right, that, in terms of generating wealth, we need to make a shift from this impoverished mindset. And then, later on, 8 years later, they said, where do we sell this commodity? So I've been to India twice. Some of our people been there every 40 days for a year to say we have this great deposit, we have this great resource. And they're saying, well, Belarus, why do we deal with you and not Brad Wall? I said, well, Brad Wall's partially right, but in a way he's misleading you. Because there's 74 jurisdictions in Saskatchewan where Brad Wall does not have one bit of say. And that's on First Nation land. So he says, well, he says he controls all the resources in Saskatchewan. No, he doesn't control all the resources. So we had to explain treaty, we had to explain who we are. And then after, lots of discussion, we're actually known as the Red Indians in the British Empire. So you guys are the Red Indians. Yeah, that's who we are. So we signed a 100 million metric ton contract with India to deliver potash over 20 years. And that secures a market that obviously producers globally, Russia, Saskatchewan, those types of producers are going to think, well, how does this little reserve that we can't even pronounce, Muscoegan, we've heard all types of pronunciations of it. It's those guys. How do they do that? So I've come to believe that those, what our forefathers gave to us is so powerful, it's so much, but it's up to us to realize what's there. What can we do as we take steps forward to attract this type of investment on reserve? The one real challenge we have right now is how do we start writing checks? And I've explained this to the department. You develop great tools. I'm not here to bash the department. I'm just stating what we presented is. You create these great tools, and then you run for the hills. And you expect chief and council to defend the tools that you create. Why are chief and council defending the tools of the department? The government of Canada needs to defend their own policy, their own economic development tools, their own land management systems. And I think once that gets to a point where we can work together, I believe we're going to see a lot more billions of dollars coming on reserve. And, really that's what I'm here to share, that I believe we don't have to go off reserve to do business. We can do that on reserve. We can create our own First Nation economies. We can create our own markets that we can participate. We don't need to go and discount our commodity, discount our land, the value of our land, just to get into the game. So that's what, share that much of our story. Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Belrose. We want to expand on that in a few minutes. Andrew Leach, you have over 2 decades of experience working with First Nations across this country. And the nations that you are working with, I imagine, are at various levels of economic strength and economic security. Can you share some of your perspectives and learning on what are the factors that contribute to First Nations economic success and economic sustainability?
Okay, yeah, thank you. First, I guess what stands out most for me is no matter where you are on the spectrum, if you will, there's an opportunity to move forward and in leaps and bounds. And when I first started going into First Nations communities 20 years ago or so, the numbers that we were dealing with back then aren't anywhere the numbers that we're dealing with now. We're dealing with some pretty decent numbers now, right? Like Chief mentions, $1 billion. I wasn't hearing billion 20 years ago. They just weren't on the table back then. And so now you're walking into places and you're seeing that. It is billion-dollar businesses that we're talking about. Those are substantive businesses. Yet you still can go into some areas that they're still trying to get off the ground. And you still see the spinning wheels, I'll call it that. And you say, well, what is the difference between this community here or this community there? What are they doing differently that makes it work? And I've observed that. I've been very keen in observing the ones that have done well. And you don't have to be sitting on a ton of oil or diamonds to do this, by the way. You can be in the middle of a desert. What is it that they've done that gets them there? And the first thing that stood out for me was having the right strategy. And you would think, well, yeah, that makes sense, of course. But you'd be surprised about how many you go into places, they just don't have the right strategy. Or they were in the ballpark, but they didn't quite hit the nail on the head, right? So we all know we've got this great natural resource in our backyard, but what's your role in that, right? Some try to take off a big bite and they can't chew, and some just take a few nibbles and that's all they end up with. So you got to know what to go after in that sector. And you got to surround yourself with really good people. It starts right from the leadership. You got to know your role as the leader. You're not there to go and run the businesses. You're there to set the environment and climate for success. That's a really important responsibility. Do you know the difference between running a business and setting the climate for success? With the managers too, you know, you have to hire really good managers. I know we're all intent on hiring our own people. That's one common thing you hear. But the key positions, you've got to hire the right people, the best people. And I've seen so much when you can bring a really good person in who knows what they're doing, knows the sector, knows how the game's played, and passes that knowledge on to your own people around and builds that capacity. If you can find somebody who can do that, they're well worth the time and investment. And I think the third thing I've seen is the right partners. We've all seen it. Partners have come in and said, oh, we'll get you the moon and we'll do all these wonderful things for you, but they just take everything and leave. So finding really good partners who can get you to that place is key. The partners that I've seen have been really good are those that actually bring money to the table. It's one of the funny things I've seen from some First Nations. They'll cut a deal with somebody and they'll say, we can do all these wonderful things, but they don't even bring money to the table. It's like we're giving them this wide open door to access the resources, and they're not even bringing money to the table. It's like, make sure, guys, because those are the things that we lack. We lack money and expertise. Make sure they bring, they'll tell you they bring the expertise, but make sure they bring the money as well. If you can find a partner like that who you can work with and develop the kind of relationship for the successes that you're wanting, then great. It's interesting, some of the communities I'm working with now, one of the problems is what to do with the money. And that's an interesting story we should start talking about sometime. What I've seen is, in some cases, we're repeating the government's mistakes, if you will, where people expect us to just continually hand out money. And one of the things that comes from that, I find, is our program dollars start getting fat. We make money, where do we put it? We should be putting it into more businesses, more investment, and we just start fattening up our programs. I've got a place where, you know, I got, frankly, more staff than I need. I should be saying that. I like having lots of staff, but, you know, we got all these monies that we're putting into those things. But that's what people at home relate to, a job, going somewhere, getting that. But I really believe that one of the things that we need to do is be smart with the monies and start thinking about that. And I think one of the things, other things is the distribution topic that starts coming up. I've always thought of the idea of a hand out, a hand up, not a hand out. And what does that mean? How does that look? And I think if you can start thinking about what those hand ups are and concretely establishing them within your infrastructure, those will be keys to success, because if not, you're just going to keep repeating this cycle. And what we're all striving for is autonomy, independence, self-sufficiency, and these are some of the things I've seen in the communities I've worked for.
Thank you, Andrew. Chief Belrose, I'd like to pick up on your story about the potash business and the exports to India. In the context of Andrew's comments, I'm hearing partnerships being critical. Can you give us a perspective on corporate Indigenous partnerships? How important are they to the business that you're doing, to the business you want to do?
Yeah, so in terms of, partnerships, I believe we need to reward investors for coming on reserve, companies for coming on reserve, not penalize them. So right now, in terms of being on reserve, you can get hit with this royalty. You come off reserve, there's resource surcharges, there's all of these, right? So eventually, if there's too many surcharges and too many taxes, you become unviable. You're not viable. So we have to have those real healthy discussions as governments as to say, what's wrong with a First Nation collecting this royalty or that tax? What's wrong with passing some savings on to a partner or a company? There's nothing wrong with that. And right now, as an example, through our journey with FNCDA, First Nation Commercial Industrial Development Act, all of those costs are borne by the proponent. So you're spending money on drilling, exploration, creating jobs, but then you're throwing out money to fees because no one from Canada will pay for their own tools that they're implementing. That's all borne. So if these potential partners are constantly paying, no one's going to want to come on to reserve. We have to find a way to share those expenses, especially in the first few years when projects are, at higher risk because of the greater debt and the challenges of paying back that debt. All of these fees on top of that become challenges.
Thank you. Chief Acres, could I ask you the same question? Has your nation entered into partnerships with Corporate Canada as an example, and what has your experience been?
I like Mr. Leach's comments because we've been approached by a lot of entrepreneurs and developers because our land in Regina is so valuable. We've had many different companies approach us, and we've been down that road where people promise you the moon, but then they want you to take out your checkbook, right? When they, when you start negotiating with them, but we're currently we've developed a limited partnership with APCO Sustainable Communities to develop 40 acres of land in our Regina Westlands. Our Regina, it's called our Soto Crossing development, and it's sandwiched between a new residential development in Regina called Westera to the east of us and the Global Transportation Hub to the west of us. And so that partnership, it's not an easy thing to enter into a partnership. You have two different cultures, right? You've got corporate culture and you've got the corporate culture that you've developed at your own First Nation. And so it does take a longer time, I believe, to develop these partnerships because you need to understand each other's corporate culture. And our corporate culture was very different from APCO's corporate culture. So we're developing 40 acres of land there, and we've learned a lot about who we're looking for in terms of partnership. We've been through the development of a business charter that overrides all of our limited partnership structures. Like all of our entities have to abide by these standards set out in our business charter. So that work really guides how we do business, how we enter into partnerships.
Thank you. Andrew, I'd like to look a little bit at the government side of this equation. If we look at the federal government, the provincial government, even municipal governments, are there things that should be done differently or that the governments are not doing to contribute to community economic development? What advice would you give?
What a loaded question. We're government people. Okay.
Government people, take your pens out.
No, it's
Words
all
of
good.
wisdom?
It's all good. Okay, so yeah, I think again, going back to the notion of strategy, I'd love to see a very clear, coherent strategy about what it is that the intention is to move forward on economic development. And we talked earlier today about a $27–28 billion gap. I've always been a believer that you go after the low-hanging fruit first, right? I don't need to clear that thing $27 billion next year, but I bet you I could do a pretty good dent at $5 billion of it with that low-hanging fruit. Do we know what that $5 billion gap is that would be low-hanging fruit? You know, I don't know the answer to that, but I think if we did some quick scanning and analysis, we could come up with that and go after that. I believe that's an area that I would start doing. There's been some pent-up demand from the previous government, obviously, and so there's been this huge, let's do everything now, and I think they're probably starting to feel some of the pressures of that. So rather than just turning off the valve and saying no, or keeping it flooding and having the problems that come with that, I think it's about smart investing. And I've always believed, and we all know this, I've seen more return on the investments of the economic development dollars than I have in any other area. So I think we need to be putting our money smartly into that area. And how would we go about doing that? So to me, those are some of the things that I think about in what we're moving forward. Now that's just on the funding side. There's obviously some policy issues and some legislative issues. And I think what I've liked so far the most is the continuing the dialogue. And I'm surprised still that some nations still have to talk to governments in their regions where they're being talked down to. It just surprises me that you have to deal with that. Because to me, you know, we've had to learn, teach people, government bureaucrats and the politicians that, you know what, we're actually pretty smart, and some of us might even be a bit smarter than some of you. You know, truthfully, the smartest people I've met have been First Nations people. I've met some smart people, but the smart people who I know are First Nations people. And so, to me, there's this relationship that needs to be clearly established and understood, that we are equals, we are partners. And sometimes when you hold the purse strings, you can control them a little too much. You just got to be careful of that. I've seen that in Australia. I've watched how that works. They went and tried to do their closing, their gap, and after this much time, they've got just a little bit to show for it. And I do believe some of that is because that mindset's still there. And we've got to make sure we break that, because we're a pretty smart, capable bunch if you let us do the work, and you'll see some great results.
Thank you. Chief Acres, I know you have something to say on this.
Yeah, by the, what Andrew said reminded me of some of the work that we're doing. We're undertaking this conversation with Canada, with the Crown. It's called an exploratory process. We're not interested in pursuing anything under the inherent rights policy, but we do want to talk to Canada about how we can revitalize or reconstitute our relationship between Treaty 4 and the Treaty 4 First Nations and Canada in right of the Crown. So I think one of the big problems we have, like we talk about trust, we talk about certainty, we talk about First Nations not having the freedom to be able to move forward on pursuing economic development because of the regulatory and legislative framework. So we talk to Canada about letting them know that we want to reconstitute our own Indigenous accountability framework that we can operate within. It's all there. It's all there in our own laws. We need to, develop some hybrid law that will manage our legal responsibility with Canada and the provinces. But at the same time, it'll build trust with our people, because that's key, right, Chief, to to getting things done. You need to involve the people, and you have to build that trust with the people. So they need to know that there's this accountability framework that that we all fall within, and we shouldn't have to negotiate with Canada through the inherent rights policy on developing this accountability framework. Right, our people come first. That's our law. We just need to we need to be provided the opportunity to completely express our own accountability framework as First Nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chief Belrose, I'm curious about the comment that Andrew made about low-hanging fruit and billions of dollars and where can they best be applied. We all know the social indicators, the economic indicators, and where we are at in the context of the world. What is the low-hanging fruit? Are there opportunities to make rapid and meaningful progress without having to wait decades to see results? What is the low-hanging fruit?
I think it depends where you are. Geographically, some are fly-in First Nations, some are remote, some are right next to urban, right? So it's a vast scale. It's hard to answer specifically what could be, and then everybody go. It's all depends where you are, where you're located, and sometimes that location really does matter. And there are times where it's expensive to get to do business, and that's a reality. So urban, obviously, land development, remote is industrial development, mining, participating, fly-in, big barriers, lack of infrastructure, lack of roads, lack of all of that, right? So that we have to deal with.
Thank you. We have about 13 or 14 minutes for questions. I'd like to open it up to the floor. Questions you may have for the panelists.
Hi, is it working? I'm Jody Boone from here in Ottawa. Hi, Andrew. I have a question about provincial attitudes, and I think it's great that we have someone from BC up there, and then we have two people who are chiefs in Saskatchewan, and I'm just wondering, to what extent does it make a big difference which province and what provincial leadership you're dealing with, and how, in particular, in the areas of the so-called historic treaties, do you counter that attitude among the particular provincial bureaucrats that you sold the farm so long ago, and why are you even sort of at our doorstep? How do you work with that?
Yeah, I guess, really it's the challenge we have right now is in the province that our treaty, superseded, is that provinces like our people in jail, provinces like our kids in care, and provinces like us on welfare. Because then we're consumers. We're not contributors. And where we're from, we're a commodity. Our kids are a commodity. And that's the reality we face. I don't want our people in jail. I don't want our kids in care. So when you bring forward opportunities, that's the challenge of trying to develop that type of partnership. Other regions, other provinces may have better examples, but for us, jail, welfare, and child welfare. And that's what I'm sick and tired of that, right? Because we're at 140,000 people now out of 1 million. And pretty soon we're going to have 0.25%, 25% of the population. So it's a challenge.
Thank you. Other questions?
I made a comment on the question.
Absolutely.
Good question, Jody. Thank you. Good to see you again. I find it interesting that it doesn't matter what government you work with, what people you work with. You just have to, you're either going to get them there the long way or the short way on what you're trying to do. And the long way is going to court and saying, we're not on the same page, we're going to go to court and we're going to fight this and we're going to win. And we've been pretty successful in the courts. And so they inevitably have to come around because it's just draining and tiring to go down that path. somewhere along the line, you're going to have to realize we got to try to work together. And when you start working together, you start learning a lot from each other. I've learned a lot from my government counterparts on just how to run a government, right? Some may say, you're learning from the wrong people, but I've learned a lot. I've learned a lot of good things, a lot of good processes. And I think some of the things that they've gotten back is, we're very communal. We're very collective in our decision making. And we've learned a lot from each other, I think, along the way. And when you can start creating a partnership that's mutually beneficial, then things really start to take off. Whether they're from the far right or the far left or whoever, at some point you have to start to talk and listen and work with each other. And I think if you can get to that place, then that's great. But it takes a bit of time and a bit of work to get there, but you can with any people, I find.
Thank you. JP.
This question's directed at both chiefs and Chief Belrose. I'm a huge fan in what you're trying to do in your community. I think often there's this propensity of our communities to look always to the non-Indigenous business community for support. And I think people in this room are starting to understand that there's a significant amount of experience and wealth generation that our communities are gaining. And to Andrew's point around some of the smartest people you've met are Indigenous. How far and wide have you searched for other Indigenous support through either financing or business partnerships? Because it's, across the region, like for instance, as an example, I'm from Northern Ontario, and running 60AB offers me some really interesting insight of, say, a ring or a fire project, and then having a lot of friends in Fort McMurray, communities there, and say, JP, can you get us connected to the Ring of Fire community? We want to build businesses and invest in what they're doing because there's so much economic activity. So what does that look like in your world for the two chiefs?
But Chief Akers, I wonder if you could perhaps give us that perspective. The question is around working collaboratively with other First Nations across the country.
I think that we have a lot of work to do, reconciliation to do among ourselves as First Nations. I think there's been we've been corralled into this thinking that we're under the Indian Act and we're competing for funding with our neighbor next door, or we're competing to purchase some Crown land that's come available. And I think that these processes have really disrupted our kinship. We're all related. Dr. Delorme here, she's probably my cousin because my mom was a Delorme from Cowsis, and they originated from the Red River area, right? And we're all related. We have the Indian Act has promoted this concept of competition rather than cooperation among ourselves, right? And it wasn't like that before, right? We always, my grandparents came from, a set of my grandparents came from Pasqua. And they transferred to Cowsis, right? And my Mosham Baptiste came from a different First Nation, right? We're all related. Our kinship laws tell us that we must help each other. And I think that we have a lot of work to do internally to break down the systems of colonization that have erased our laws of kinship, erased our laws of cooperation. And the residential school has taught us that as well. Those of us who went know that's what we were taught in school, was competition. The teachers and the nuns they'd favor others, and others would be ostracized. And so we have a lot of work to do in our own communities to rebuild our kinship laws so that we can have real cooperation with each other.
Thank you. Chief Belrose, can you add to that conversation? JP was talking about the work he's done nationally with First Nations, and have you worked with other nations, learned from them, or shared your learnings with them?
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I have the highest confidence for chiefs, not not just because I've been one for 12 years, but I really believe that they're honest. They try to work together. We share ideas, and governments have less confidence, but our own chiefs, and that's really where I see a lot of collaboration. I see a lot of opportunity to share best practices. Like one of the best practices that was going across like wildfire for a while, you have to separate business from politics. But what I've learned through my own experience, you have to manage that, not just separate, because you can send your greatest person out there and somehow they're looking around, okay, good to meet you, but where's the chief? And then that's a reality. So, and then there's times you need that politics around you too. So I've come to learn it's not an entire separation. And then when you manage the business and politics, I believe not every independent board member needs to be a non-native person, a lawyer, a financier. We can go to independent board members from First Nations across the country. It doesn't have to be, an expert in whatever city you're near, because those people oftentimes come with their own agendas as well, and that agenda is not necessarily to help the nation. So in terms of that, I've learned a very hard way that choose your independent board members carefully, and if you can, use the First Nations.
Thank you. I like that, not just separate, manage. Dr. Littlechild.
Yes, thank you very much. Just one quick thought, more than a question, I suppose. Given what the Minister of Justice, Jody Wilson-Raybould, said earlier, which I thought was a very, very fantastic presentation, we've heard the Indian Act being thrown out quite a bit. We've heard another act being propped up, First Nations Land Management Act. Is it time in this review that the minister is undertaking with a committee, a legislative and policy review, to consider incorporating all the good elements, the successful elements of economic development? Is it time for an Indigenous Economic Development Act? Or if that has been canvassed already, what has been the result? But I throw that out there as a thought. Is it time for an Indigenous or First Nations Economic Development Act that incorporates all the good elements of success? It incorporates perhaps implementation of the treaty, right to economic development, and so on.
Thank you for that. Could I have some perspectives on that, Andrew? Oh, Chief Akers, go ahead.
I think that I think treaty is sufficient, right, to express and realize the full potential of economic development for our people and our relationship with both the province and the federal government. I don't believe that economic development and our relationship with Canada should ever be legislated. I think that we've seen too much legislation already. I think that we need to start building our own framework so that our people are going to trust us. Right? It's too easy for us to, as leadership or whatever, to use Canada as a buffer, right? To not enforce our own due diligence on one another in order to hold each other accountable, for our people to hold us accountable, right? That's our primary responsibility, right? And I think that legislation, federal legislation, has really come between our responsibility to our people and our people's responsibility to each other. And that's my feeling about federal legislation. I've seen it all, and we need a better way. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Andrew or Chief Bellerose, this will be our last question. Do you have a perspective on that, an Indigenous Economic Development Act?
No.
thinking about the nation that I work for in Vancouver. They have developed $1 billion plus of on-reserve property that they've sold off. They've used the Land Management Act and their own land code to do that. In partnership with Squamish and Musqueam, we've now acquired $1 billion of off-reserve property in the lower mainland of Vancouver. And I don't know how we could develop an economic law around that. It's just, we're getting into fee simple, open market type of stuff, but we're in it. And it does beg the question of where we're going to go as we continue to grow. And I do see those opportunities there, because our traditional territory is not just the reserve land, it's the whole region, right? But I do wonder about the policies and the supporting legislation that would prop up a lot of the economic activity that we're trying to do. I'm just not sure I'm trying to grasp around calling it an Economic Development Act or something like that. We're trying to figure out what that would work on. But certainly there are nations who are working with what we've got. They're not great, but some are making some use out of them for now.
You have the anchor position. You have the final words.
Thank you. Just with this, really, whatever it is, I try to have an open mind to, whatever suggestions, whatever recommendations. And really how I see it is we need Canada to come on reserve and give guarantees. And however that tool looks, however that looks, because you can't expect private investors to come on if the Canadian government will not come and stand with its legislation, with its system. We've heard the guarantee that went to the Quebec company. We hear about this subsidy for that. Yet we come in and we get steered to the department, says go there and go under corp or go under. Some of the stuff we're doing is beyond that system. And I really believe that the federal government needs to find a way to assist with guarantees. Through that, we've heard of all of the development. We come in, ownership. Well, you can't own because you can't bring nothing forward. Well, how do we participate just in jobs, just in training? You got to participate in ownership. And that's really what I believe. And there is a thing called earned equity. We're not asking to be given something for free. We're willing to put whatever we can and help contribute to whatever we need. But that's going to have to come in that type of form. So thank you.
Thank you. Chief Acus, Chief Belrose, Mr. Leach, thank you so much for spending the time with us, sharing your wisdom, your stories, your advice, and your guidance. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We've earned another coffee break, so we reconvene in 15 minutes, and we will be having a session with National Chief Bellegarde, so we'll be starting promptly. See you in 15 minutes.